A retired military working dog stayed behind to guard a remote cabin while his handler, a Navy SEAL, was away trying to survive another hard stretch of life. When cruel men came looking for him, they didn't steal a thing. They chose something worse. They hung the dog from a tree and beat him not to kill, but to send a message. But the real tragedy wasn't what they did to the dog. It was what their cruelty awakened in a man who had tried to bury his past. A ghost they
You're
should have
gonna be
never
okay,
disturbed.
buddy.
Before we begin, tell
Let's
us where
check
you are
that
watching
leg.
from, and if this
Good
story
boy.
touches your heart,
Hey,
please
buddy, you're
subscribe
being
for more
so
stories
brave.
of loyalty,
The doctor
faith,
will fix
and
you
courage.
right up.
Marcus Wolf's
That's my good
steel-toed
boy.
boot cracked into the dog's ribs. Atlas yelped, blood sprayed across gravel. Two men laughed in the darkness. They didn't know that German Shepherd had dragged 5 SEALs from a Taliban ambush in Kandahar. Didn't know he'd detected 23 IEDs before they could kill. Didn't know his handler was buying coffee at a gas station 50 yards down the road. They had no idea what was coming. The youngest of the 3 men, Ethan Hale, was 23 years old with a face too smooth for the cruelty in his eyes. He raised a steel rod above his head, grinning at his companions. "This is for the boss," he said, and brought it down hard. Atlas tried to stand. His back leg, damaged by shrapnel in a firefight years ago, buckled beneath him. He'd been trained not to show pain, not to give away position, not to break. Even now, bleeding onto the dirt outside a darkened cabin in the Oregon wilderness, he made no sound beyond that first involuntary yelp. Lyle Croft, 35, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, grabbed a length of rope from the bed of their truck. "Get him to the tree." The third man, Marcus Wolf, was the leader. 38 years old, beard going gray at the edges, eyes flat and calculating. He'd done this kind of work before. Not often, but enough times to know exactly how far they could go without crossing the line into something that would bring real heat. "Careful," Marcus said. "We're sending a message, not making a murder." They dragged Atlas toward a thick-limbed pine at the edge of the clearing. The dog fought every inch, his training surging up through the pain. He twisted, snapped his jaws at reaching hands, dug his claws into the soft earth. But there were 3 of them, and only one of him, and that damaged leg wouldn't hold his weight anymore. They hauled him upward. The rope bit into his shoulder and neck, lifting his front paws off the ground low enough to keep him struggling, high enough to make him helpless. Atlas hung there, breath coming in controlled bursts, despite the agony radiating through his chest. His eyes remained fixed on the cabin door, on the place where his handler should have been. The first blow landed against his ribs with a sound like breaking branches. Then another, and another. Ethan laughed once, high and nervous, before Marcus shot him a look that killed the sound in his throat. "Enough noise," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't about you." They worked with ugly efficiency. Fists and boots in that steel rod, striking with just enough force to break bone and tear flesh, but never quite enough to end it. They knew their business. They'd been told exactly what to do. When Atlas's body finally went slack, when blood matted his black and tan coat and one eye had swollen nearly shut, Marcus raised a hand. "That'll do," he said. Lyle wiped his knuckles on his jeans, breathing hard. "Boss said to make it clear." "It's clear." Marcus pulled a knife from his pocket and turned to the tree. With slow, deliberate strokes, he carved into the bark. The sound was harsh and final in the night air. When he finished, 2 words stood out pale against the dark trunk: "Last warning." He stepped close to Atlas, close enough that the dog could see him through his one good eye. "Your owner should have listened," Marcus said, as if the dog could carry the message. "Now he'll understand." They left without looking back. Boots crunching on gravel, truck doors slamming, engine fading into the distance. Silence rushed back in. Atlas hung alone in the darkness, the rope cutting into his shoulder, pain pulsing through him in waves that matched his slowing heartbeat. Time passed strangely. Minutes stretched thin. The cold seeped into his bones. But worse than the pain, worse than the cold, was the waiting. He listened for the sound of a familiar truck, for boots on gravel, for the scent of the man who was supposed to be there. Nothing came. Somewhere near dawn, the fog began to lift, revealing the pale edge of morning. Atlas's breathing had gone shallow, each breath a careful effort. His body trembled, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the cabin, as if willing it to wake to answer him. Miles away, Garrett Sullivan finished loading timber onto a flatbed truck and started the long drive home, unaware that the quiet he'd trusted had been broken, and that the warning waiting for him was written not in words, but in blood and rope and silence. Autumn had settled over the Cascade Mountains like a held breath. Mist drifted low between dark pines. The air was cool enough to sting the lungs, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel deliberate. Garrett Sullivan had chosen Pine Ridge, Oregon because it was empty, or so he thought. The cabin sat alone on 20 rough acres at the edge of nowhere, where the paved road thinned to gravel and then simply gave up. The logs were weather-darkened, the roof patched unevenly with mismatched shingles, the porch sagging just enough to remind him nothing here was permanent. Garrett liked it that way. Permanence was a lie he'd learned to distrust. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, but built lean rather than bulky, the kind of strength shaped by 18 years of use instead of mirrors. His hair, once dark brown, had begun to fade with gray at the temples. He kept it cut short out of habit, the same way he kept his beard trimmed close to his jaw. His eyes were steel blue and perpetually alert, belonging to a man who'd learned that stillness could be louder than violence. People in town said he looked older than his years. Garrett knew it wasn't time that had aged him. It was memory. He'd served 18 years as a Navy SEAL, 7 deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Retired in 2022 with 40% hearing loss in his right ear, shrapnel scars across his back, and nightmares that turned sleep into a battlefield. The VA disability check of $23.40 a month wasn't enough to live on, but combined with odd jobs, hauling timber, and fixing machinery for farmers who paid cash, he scraped by. Barely. He owed $47,000 in medical debt from a back surgery the VA hadn't fully covered, interest piling faster than he could dig out. But he had the cabin, the mountains, silence, and he had Atlas. The German Shepherd was 9 years old now, large even by the breed standards. His coat was deep black and tan-scarred lightly along the flank where a piece of shrapnel had torn through muscle in Helmand province. One ear was notched from a different fight, a different lifetime. He moved slower than he once had, his back right leg stiff on cold mornings, the legacy of that same shrapnel wound. But his eyes remained sharp and intelligent, dark brown, and endlessly watchful. This was not a dog that chased squirrels or barked at passing birds. This was a ba that had been trained to find explosives, to detect ambushes, to pull wounded men from burning vehicles. Atlas had served alongside Garrett for 6 years, from 2016 to 2022. They'd been a team in the truest sense, not master and pet, but partners. Brothers in everything but blood. In Kabul, August 2021, when the building collapsed during the evacuation chaos, it was Atlas who dragged Garrett from the rubble with pieces of metal embedded in both their bodies. Garrett had woken in a field hospital with Atlas lying beside his cot, the dog refusing to leave despite his own injuries. The medic had said, "That dog saved your life, pulled you 20 meters through fire." Garrett had reached down and rested his hand on Atlas's head. Not the first time. When Garrett's enlistment ended and he'd walked away from the uniform, the Navy had offered him a choice. Atlas could be reassigned to a new handler, or Garrett could adopt him under the K-9 Veterans Adoption Program. There had been no choice at all. They'd come to Pine Ridge together, two broken things trying to figure out how to be whole again. Garrett spent his mornings working with his hands, splitting firewood, repairing fence posts scavenged from a nearby abandoned property, fixing whatever time and weather had loosened. Money was always tight, but working kept his mind from wandering to places he didn't want it to go. Atlas stayed close, usually lying in a patch of sunlight on the porch or patrolling the perimeter with that distinctive limping gait. He rarely barked, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make most people think twice about approaching uninvited. That morning, as the fog lifted and weak November sunlight filtered through the pines, a black SUV slowed on the gravel road. Garrett straightened from the wood pile, instinctively placing himself between the vehicle and the cabin. Atlas rose without command, moving to stand at Garrett's left knee. His posture was calm but unmistakably alert. The SUV stopped. A man stepped out. He was well-dressed for a place like this. Victor Kane was in his early 60s, tall and lean, his silver-streaked hair carefully combed, boots polished despite the mud. He wore confidence the way some men wore cologne, heavy and intentional. His smile was practiced, warm enough to disarm, but it never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan," he said as if tasting the name. "I'm Victor Kane. I represent a group of investors interested in this area." Garrett didn't offer his hand. He'd learned to read people in places where reading them wrong meant dying. This man had the look of someone who'd never been told no and hadn't liked it the few times it happened. "Not interested," Garrett said. Kane's smile didn't falter. He glanced at the cabin, then at the surrounding forest, his gaze lingering on Atlas for just a fraction too long. "Everything has a price, Mr. Sullivan. This land, these 20 acres, we're prepared to offer $200,000. Cash. That's double the assessed value. Not for sale. Progress is coming to Pine Ridge whether folks want it or not." Kane's voice remained light conversational. "Resort development, high-end vacation properties. This whole valley will be transformed within 5 years. People who get in early will do very well. People who don't, he shrugged. Well, they tend to get left behind. And Garrett's expression didn't change. I said no. Kane looked at Atlas again, and this time his smile sharpened into something else, something colder. War dogs, he said softly. They never really retire, do they? Always on guard, loyal to the end. He paused deliberately. Dogs don't live forever, Mr. Sullivan. 10 years is about average for a shepherd, especially one with health issues. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Garrett took a single step forward, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and level. Leave. Don't come back. For a moment, something flickered in Kane's eyes. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that he was standing in front of a man who'd done violence and would do it again if pushed. Then the smile returned, smooth as oil. Think about my offer, Kane said, climbing back into the SUV. Things have a way of getting complicated for people who refuse to adapt. The vehicle pulled away, dust curling in its wake. Atlas watched until it vanished around the bend, then sat ears still high. Garrett stood there for a long moment, his jaw tight. He'd come to Pine Ridge to disappear, to live small, to let the noise of the world fade into the background. He'd been a fool to think it would last. The next 3 weeks passed like a slow-turning screw, each rotation adding pressure. First, it was small things. The mailbox at the end of the drive was knocked over a boot print, clear in the soft earth beside it. Garrett found a spent shotgun shell on the porch steps placed deliberately where he'd step on it. A warning. A promise. Then his truck. All 4 tires slashed while he was inside the hardware store in town. The window on the driver's side smashed with a rock that had been left on the seat with a note scrawled in marker last chance. The sheriff's deputy who responded was young, maybe 25, with a face that said he'd rather be anywhere else. He took photos, filled out a report, and told Garrett there wasn't much they could do without evidence. Probably just kids, the deputy said, not meeting his eyes. Garrett didn't argue. He knew better. This wasn't kids. This was pressure applied with precision designed to make him feel isolated and vulnerable. One Tuesday evening, his phone rang. Dr. Nora Whitmore. She was 58, a veterinarian who ran a small practice on the outskirts of Pine Ridge. Tall and gray-haired, she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who'd spent 20 years in the Army Veterinary Corps before retiring to civilian life. Garrett, she said without preamble, someone came by the clinic today asking about Atlas. White male, 50s or 60s, expensive suit, wanted to know his medical history, his age, whether he had any chronic conditions. Garrett's hand tightened on the phone. What did you tell him? Nothing. Told him client confidentiality applies to animals too, and that he could take his questions somewhere else. She paused. But Garrett, be careful. That man wasn't making small talk. He was gathering information. I know. Do you need help? I'll handle it. But thank you, Nora. He hung up and looked at Atlas, who was lying near the wood stove, head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes were open, watching Garrett with that steady, unblinking gaze that seemed to see straight through him. They're trying to scare me, Garrett said quietly, through you. Atlas's tail thumped once against the floor. The call came on a Friday morning. A timber company in Idaho needed a hauler for an emergency job. 3 days of work, $2,800 cash. The foreman was apologetic. Another driver had quit without notice, and they were desperate. Garrett stood in the cabin, phone to his ear, doing the math in his head. $2,800 would cover the interest payment on his credit cards, with enough left over to fix the truck's broken window and buy groceries for the month. He looked at Atlas. The dog had lifted his head, ears forward, as if he could sense the decision being made. Garrett hated leaving him. In 3 years, he'd never been away from the cabin for more than a day. But the money was too good to pass up, and he told himself it was only 3 days. 72 hours. What could happen in 3 days? He accepted the job. The night before he left, Garrett prepared the cabin with the kind of methodical care he'd once used to prepare for missions. He filled Atlas's water bowl and left out 3 days' worth of food in sealed containers measured and labeled. He checked the simple alarm system. He'd rigged motion sensors that would send a text to his phone if triggered. Nothing fancy, but better than nothing. He walked the perimeter of the property with Atlas at his side, checking the fence line, looking for signs of disturbance. Everything was quiet. The forest breathed around them, pine-scented and cold. Back inside, Garrett knelt in front of Atlas and rested his forehead against the dog's head. Atlas leaned into him, solid and warm. 3 days, Garrett murmured. Same as always, you watch the house, I come back. That's the deal. Atlas pressed his muzzle into Garrett's chest, and for a moment they stayed like that, two broken soldiers holding each other up. "I won't let anything happen to you," Garrett said. "I promise." It was a promise he had no way of keeping. He left before dawn, the truck's headlights cutting through the pre-morning darkness. In the rearview mirror, he could see Atlas standing at the edge of the porch, silhouetted against the cabin's lit window. By the time the sun rose, Garrett was 200 miles away, heading north toward Idaho, and a job that would keep him away just long enough for everything to fall apart. Atlas stood on the porch long after the sound of the truck had faded. Then he turned and began his patrol, limping along the familiar routes he'd walked 1,000 times before, guarding a place that was about to be invaded by men who didn't know what kind of war dog they were coming for. The first day passed without incident. Atlas moved through his routine with military precision patrol, at dawn rest in the sun patrol, at midday rest, again patrol, at dusk. His leg ached more than usual in the cold, but he ignored it the way he'd been trained to ignore discomfort. The second day was the same. Quiet. Still. The second night was when everything changed. Ruth Aldridge lived half a mile down the road in a small farmhouse she'd owned for 40 years. She was 68 years old, white-haired and work-hardened, with hands that had raised goats and chickens and 3 children. Her husband had died in 2018, leaving her alone with the land and the animals and the kind of loneliness that settles into your bones. She'd met Garrett exactly twice. Once at the general store where they'd nodded politely. Once when her truck had broken down near his property and he'd stopped to help, refusing payment, his manner quiet and courteous. She liked him, liked that he kept to himself and didn't make trouble. She walked her property every morning at dawn, had done so for decades. It was routine, ritual, the way she stayed connected to land that had been in her family for 3 generations. On that particular morning, with frost still white on the grass and her breath misting in the cold air, she heard something that didn't belong. A sound like a wounded animal, low and pained, coming from the direction of Garrett Sullivan's property. Ruth changed direction, walking faster, despite the stiffness in her knees. She knew Garrett had left. She'd seen his truck pass by 2 days ago heading toward the highway. She also knew he had that dog, the big German shepherd with the limp. She found Atlas hanging from the pine tree at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. Her mind rejected it, tried to make it into something else, something that made sense. But there was no other explanation. The dog had been beaten, badly. Blood had dried in dark patches on his coat. One eye was swollen shut. He hung from a rope tied around his shoulder and neck, his front paws just barely touching the ground, his body sagging with exhaustion and pain. But he was alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His one good eye tracked her movement as she approached. "Oh God," Ruth whispered. "Oh God, what did they do to you?" She pulled her phone from her pocket with shaking hands and dialed 911. Then she called the number Garrett had given her when he'd helped with her truck, leaving a voicemail because he didn't answer. Then she did the only thing she could do. She found a knife in her truck, cut the rope, and lowered Atlas as gently as her old arms would allow. The dog whimpered once the first sound of pain he'd allowed himself to make. "I've got you," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "I've got you. Help is coming." She sat in the dirt with Atlas's head in her lap, her fingers gentle on his blood-stained fur, and waited for someone to come save a dog who'd spent his whole life saving others. Garrett was 3 hours into the drive back to Pine Ridge when he got Ruth's voicemail. He listened to it twice, her voice shaking, saying something about Atlas and hurt, and please come home right now. He didn't remember much about the next 3 hours. Just the white line of the highway disappearing under his wheels, his hands locked on the steering wheel, his mind refusing to think, refusing to imagine, because if he let himself imagine, he'd drive the truck straight off the road. He made calls, left voicemails, texted people whose numbers he barely remembered. Nora Whitmore, the sheriff's office, anyone who might help. Most of all, he drove. Faster than was safe, faster than was legal, the speedometer pushing 90 on straight stretches, not caring about tickets or cops or anything except getting home. When he finally turned onto his road, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that he didn't see. His eyes were fixed on the cabin, on the clearing, on the place where Atlas should have been waiting. Ruth's truck was parked near the porch. She was sitting on the steps, and when she saw him coming, she stood up slowly, like someone who'd aged 10 years in a single day. Garrett killed the engine and got out. He couldn't make his legs work right, couldn't seem to move fast enough, even though every instinct was screaming at him to run. "Where is he?" His voice came out rough, barely human. Ruth's eyes were red. "Dr. Whitmore has him. I called her. She came right away." "Is he?" Garrett couldn't finish the question. "He's alive." But Garrett, She gestured toward the tree line. You need to see. He followed her to the pine tree, saw the rope cut and lying in the dirt, saw the dark stains on the ground that could only be blood, saw the words carved into the bark. Last warning. Something inside Garrett went very still and very cold. He'd felt this before. In Fallujah in 2007, when his convoy had been hit and 3 of his teammates had died screaming. In Mosul in 2017, when he'd called in an airstrike on bad coordinates and 4 civilians had been torn apart by American bombs. In Kabul in 2021, when the building had collapsed and Atlas had dragged him out of the rubble with pieces of metal embedded in both their bodies. It was the feeling of the world narrowing down to a single point of absolute clarity. The feeling of knowing exactly what had to be done, even if doing it destroyed you. Who did this? He asked quietly. Ruth shook her head. I don't know. I found him this morning, but he'd been hanging there all night. Maybe longer. Garrett nodded once. He walked back to his truck, got in, and drove to Nora Whitmore's clinic without saying another word. The veterinary clinic was a modest single-story building, set back from the road with a hand-painted sign and a gravel parking lot. Garrett had been there half a dozen times over the past 3 years for routine checkups, vaccinations, the kind of ordinary things that belong to an ordinary life. There was nothing ordinary about tonight. He pushed through the door into the waiting room. It was empty except for Nora, who was standing behind the front desk, with her arms crossed, her face drawn and tired. Where is he? Garrett asked. Surgery room. He's stable, but... Garrett walked past her. She didn't try to stop him. Atlas was lying on a padded table in the back room, his body wrapped in bandages, an IV line running into his front leg. His breathing was steady but shallow. His eyes were closed. Garrett's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees beside the table and pressed his forehead against the cold metal edge. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I left you alone. Nora came in behind him. She didn't touch him, didn't offer empty comfort. She just stood there and gave Hinnis the facts in her calm clinical voice. 2 broken ribs, severe bruising across his shoulders and flanks, lacerations on his neck from the rope, minor internal bleeding that I was able to stop, concussion, possible damage to his right eye I won't know for sure until the swelling goes down. She paused. Garrett, whoever did this, knew exactly what they were doing. They beat him just hard enough to cause serious pain and injury, but not hard enough to kill. This was calculated. Garrett lifted his head. His eyes were dry. He was past tears, past shock, into something colder and harder. How much? For the surgery and the medications, $8,700. He had $620 in his checking account. The money from the Idaho job hadn't been deposited yet. I'll pay you, he said. I don't know how, but I'll pay you. Nora's expression softened. Garrett, I know you're good for it. That's not what I'm worried about. She hesitated. I served in Iraq. I've seen what happens when good men get pushed too far. Whatever you're thinking of doing, I'm thinking of making sure this doesn't happen again. Through legal channels, Garrett didn't answer. He turned back to Atlas, resting his hand gently on the dog's flank, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. Nora sighed. He needs to stay here for at least 48 hours, maybe longer. I'll call you if anything changes. I'm not leaving him. Garrett, I'm not leaving him. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. There's a chair in the corner. I'll bring you some coffee. Garrett sat, kept his hand on Atlas, watched the shallow rise and fall of the dog's chest, and made promises in the silence of his own mind. Promises about justice, about consequences, about making sure that the men who'd done this understood exactly what kind of mistake they'd made. Outside, the sun finished setting and darkness settled over Pine Ridge like a held breath. And somewhere in that darkness, Victor Kane sat in his expensive house, confident that he'd broken Garrett Sullivan, that the message had been delivered, that the land would be his. He had no idea that he'd just awakened something far more dangerous than an angry man. He'd awakened a warrior who'd spent 18 years learning how to hunt. Garrett Sullivan stayed at Nora's clinic until past midnight. He sat in the hard plastic chair beside Atlas's table, hand resting on the dog's flank, watching the steady rise and fall of breathing that proved his partner was still alive. Atlas slept fitfully, whimpering occasionally when dreams took him back to the attack. Each time Garrett would murmur something reassuring and the dog would settle. Around 1 a.m., Nora came in with coffee and a blanket. You should go home, she said gently. Get some rest. I'll call if anything changes. Garrett shook his head. Can't leave him again. Garrett, I left him once. That's what caused this. His voice was flat, empty of everything except guilt. I won't do it twice. Nora sighed but didn't argue further. She brought him a pillow and left him to his vigil. Garrett didn't sleep. He sat in that chair through the darkest hours making plans in the silence. Not the kind of plan that involved rage or recklessness, but the kind he'd learned to build in places where mistakes meant body bags. Observe, listen, verify, document, then act. By the time dawnlight crept through the clinic windows, turning the darkness gray, Garrett had crystallized his thoughts into something cold and precise as a blade. He drove to a gas station bathroom and washed his face in the sink, staring at the stranger in the mirror. Same steel blue eyes. Same gray-streaked hair, cut military short. But something had shifted behind those eyes. Something that hadn't been there 4 days ago. Something he'd tried very hard to bury when he left the Navy. He shaved carefully the way he used to before missions. Not for appearance, but for clarity. For the ritual of preparation. Then he bought coffee and a breakfast sandwich he didn't taste and drove back toward Pine Ridge as the sun broke pale and cold over the Cascades. The cabin waited in its clearing, quiet again as if nothing had happened. Garrett walked the perimeter, slowly reading the ground, the way he'd been trained to read terrain for IEDs and ambush points. 3 sets of boot prints overlapping. Different treads, different weights. One man heavy on his heels, another with a shorter stride. The third moved with more care, placing his feet deliberately. Tire tracks cut and recut into the soft shoulder where the gravel met dirt. He photographed them with his phone, measured the width between treads. With a piece of string, noted the depth of impression. The rope still lay at the base of the pine tree. He bagged it carefully, touching only the cut ends. There might be DNA, skin cells, something. The carving on the tree stared back at him. Last warning. The letters were crude but confident, cut with a fixed blade knife, probably 4 to 5 inches long, based on the depth and width of the marks. Garrett photographed it from 3 angles, noted the height about 6 feet, suggesting the carver was tall or had reached up deliberately. Then he saw it. Something caught his eye in the dirt near the base of the tree. A small black object partially hidden by pine needles. Garrett bent and picked it up carefully. A camera, no bigger than a matchbox wireless, the kind used for home security. The LED light on its side still blinked red battery, nearly dead, but not quite. Garrett's stomach turned cold. Kane hadn't just wanted to hurt Atlas. He'd wanted to watch it happen. Wanted to record Garrett's reaction when he found his dog hanging broken from a tree. Wanted to see him break. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. The calculation. Someone had climbed this tree, positioned this camera at the perfect angle, made sure it would capture everything. For a moment, Garrett stood frozen, imagining Kane sitting in some comfortable office watching the footage, watching Atlas fight for his life, watching Garrett discover him. Maybe Kane had smiled. Maybe he'd shown it to others. The rage that surged through Garrett was white-hot and absolute. His hand closed around the camera, crushing it. Plastic cracked. Circuits bent. The red light died. But destroying it changed nothing. The footage was already uploaded somewhere, stored, backed up. Kane had what he wanted, proof that he could reach into Garrett's life and destroy what mattered most. Garrett dropped the broken camera into his pocket. Evidence. One more piece of the puzzle Sheriff Clayton Reeves would need. He walked back to his truck with legs that felt disconnected from his body and drove into town. The general store sat on Main Street, a low clapboard building that smelled of coffee and sawdust and old wood. Garrett had been inside maybe 5 times in 3 years, always in and out, quickly avoiding conversation. Today he lingered. The owner was a round-shouldered man in his 60s named Harold, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a thinning cap of gray hair. He nodded politely when Garrett entered, then returned to counting change at the register. 2 women were talking near the coffee pot. One was maybe 45, wearing a fleece jacket and mud-stained jeans. The other was older, 70 at least, with white hair pulled back in a careful bun. Garrett poured coffee and pretended to examine bags of jerky on a nearby shelf, listening. "Told them no 3 times, the younger woman was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "But Kane keeps coming back. Last week they offered me half what the land's worth and called it generous." "They did the same to the Hendersons," the older woman replied. "Except when John said, no, someone broke their daughter's bike, snapped it clean in half and left it on their porch. Sheriff, do anything. You know Clayton, she tries, but without proof." The conversation drifted to other topics. Garrett paid for his coffee and left carrying 3 names with him. Kane, Henderson, Clayton. Outside, a patrol car rolled past unhurried. Garrett watched it park beside the sheriff's office, a modest brick building with a faded American flag hanging from a pole out front. He waited 10 minutes, then walked across the street and pushed through the door. The woman behind the desk looked up, and Garrett recognized her immediately, even though they'd never formally met. Sheriff Clayton Reeves was 53 years old, tall and straight-backed, with auburn hair, cut short and streaked with silver that caught the fluorescent light. Her face was angular, weathered with pale freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were hazel and calm, the kind of calm that came from seeing bad things and choosing not to flinch. She wore her uniform neatly. No excess jewelry except a simple watch, no makeup. She didn't need to raise her voice when she spoke. "Garrett Sullivan," she said, not a question. "Ma'am, heard about your dog, I'm sorry." She gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Sit." Garrett sat, placed his phone on the desk with the photos queued up. Clayton studied him for a long moment, the kind of assessment that felt familiar. She was reading him the way he'd read her, looking for tells, for weaknesses, for whether he could be trusted. "You served," she finally said. "Navy, 18 years. Marine Corps, 20. She nodded at his phone. "That what I think it is. Evidence. Boot prints, tire tracks, rope fibers, photographs of the carving. Atlas had paint flecks embedded in his shoulder, industrial paint, dark green. Dr. Whitmore bagged it. He pulled the crushed camera from his pocket. And this, found it at the base of the tree. Kane was recording everything." Clayton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She picked up the phone, scrolling through the photos with careful attention. When she examined the broken camera, something cold flickered in her eyes. "Victor Kane," she said quietly, setting everything down. "You're sure? As sure as I can write without proof that'll hold up in court." She opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a folder, setting it between them. "Kane's been operating in Pine Ridge for 3 years, buying up land for what he calls resort development. When people don't want to sell, things start happening. Vandalism, accidents, pressure. Has he been violent before? Not directly. That's the problem. He hires people who hire other people. By the time anything happens, his hands look clean." Clayton's jaw tightened. 3 years ago, my son Daniel owned a small farm about 10 miles from here. Kane made him an offer. Daniel said no." She paused, and in that pause, Garrett saw something crack behind her professional composure. 2 weeks later, Daniel's truck went off the road on Highway 26. Investigators said he'd been drinking. Blood alcohol, .12. Her voice stayed level, but her hands had curled into fists on the desk. "My son didn't drink, hadn't touched alcohol in 5 years. He was in recovery, went to meetings twice a week. But they closed the case. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Just a single vehicle accident on a road Daniel had driven 1,000 times." Clayton opened the folder, revealing a stack of incident reports and photographs. 7 other people have had similar experiences after refusing to sell to Kane. Property damage, animals killed. One family's house caught fire while they were at church. No one's pressed charges. Everyone's terrified. Kane has lawyers and Portland connections in county government. The one person who did try to file a complaint had their business insurance mysteriously canceled the next week. She looked at Garrett directly. "You understand what you're stepping into. I understand men like Kane think they're untouchable. They usually are. Money buys a lot of protection." "Not always," Garrett said quietly. Clayton studied him again, weighing something, making a decision. "I can't act on suspicion," she finally said. "I need proof that will stand up when lawyers get involved. Photographs, testimony, physical evidence. If I move too soon, Kane walks and everyone who helped me gets burned. Then we get you proof." Clayton's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You want Kane in handcuffs. I want the men who hurt Atlas in a cell. Seems like we're after the same thing." "What I want," Clayton said, "is justice done the right way. Through the system. Not through," she gestured vaguely at Garrett, "whatever you're thinking about doing." "I'm thinking about watching and documenting. Same as you." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. "All right," Clayton said. "Here's how this works. You don't confront anyone. You don't play hero. You watch, you document, you bring everything to me quietly. You step outside those lines, even once, I'll arrest you myself. Clear?" "Clear." "Good." She slid the folder across the desk. "These are the other victims. Start with Ruth Aldridge. You already know her. The rest might talk to you if they know I sent you." Garrett took the folder and stood. At the door, he paused. "Sheriff, your son. I'm sorry." Clayton nodded once, her expression carefully neutral. "Make sure Atlas gets well. Then we'll see about making some people sorry they ever came to Pine Ridge." By late afternoon, Garrett was back at Nora's clinic. Atlas was awake, groggy from pain medication, but responsive. When Garrett entered, the dog's tail moved in a weak approximation of a wag, and something in Garrett's chest loosened just slightly. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, kneeling beside the table. "You doing okay?" Atlas tried to lift his head, managed it this time, and leaned forward to touch his nose to Garrett's hand. Nora appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "He's stubborn, just like someone else I know. He's going to be all right. The ribs will heal, the eye's still swollen, but I don't think there's permanent damage. The concussion is the main concern right now. I need to monitor him for another 2 days at least." She studied Garrett. "You look like you haven't slept." "I'll sleep when this is over." Garrett, "I know, but I can't rest while they're out there, while Kane thinks he won." Nora sighed. "Just promise me you won't do anything that ends with you in jail or a hospital." Garrett didn't answer. He stayed with Atlas until evening, talking to him quietly, telling him about the investigation about Clayton and the other victims, about the plan forming in his mind. Atlas listened with his eyes half closed, occasionally shifting position, always keeping some part of his body in contact with Garrett's hand. When full darkness fell, Garrett finally left. He drove to the address Clayton had given him for Warren Briggs. Warren lived in a small house on the east side of town, set back from the road behind a stand of cottonwoods. He was 47 years old, a carpenter by trade with calloused hands and a face weathered from years of outdoor work. He answered the door with a shotgun in his hands, then lowered it when he saw Garrett's empty palms raised. "Sheriff Reeves sent me," Garrett said. "Said you might be willing to talk about what happened to your house." Warren studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." The interior was sparse but clean. Warren gestured to a table in the kitchen, and they sat across from each other like men preparing for negotiation. "You're the one with the dog," Warren said. "Yes." "Heard what they did. I'm sorry." Warren rubbed his jaw. "My house burned down 2 years ago. September 14th, 2023. I was at my sister's wedding in Eugene. Got a call from the fire department at 11 p.m. They determined the cause. Electrical fire, they said. Faulty wiring in the attic." Warren's hands clenched on the table. "I'd had that wiring inspected 6 months earlier. Passed with no issues. But the investigator said sometimes these things happen." "So you didn't believe that?" "No, because 3 weeks before the fire, Victor Kane offered me $60,000 for my property. I told him it wasn't for sale at any price. Week later, my tool shed got vandalized. Week after that, someone slashed the tires on my work truck." He met Garrett's eyes. "Then my house burned. You have documentation, dates, photos, the inspection report, all of it." Warren stood and pulled a cardboard box from a closet, setting it on the table. "Been saving it. Thought maybe someday someone would give a damn." Garrett went through it methodically. Insurance papers, photos of the house before and after, the electrical inspection from March 2023 showing everything up to code, police reports about the vandalism that had been filed and gone nowhere. "Can I copy these?" Garrett asked. "You can have the originals if it means Kane faces consequences." They talked for another hour. Warren gave he names other people who'd been pressured, who'd lost property, or animals, or peace of mind. A network of quiet suffering that Kane had built through intimidation and violence. When Garrett left, he had 3 more addresses and a growing picture of a man who'd turned cruelty into a business model. The next 2 days passed in a blur of conversations and documentation. Garrett spoke to the Hendersons, a couple in their 30s with 2 young children. They told him about the broken bike, about anonymous letters suggesting their daughter might have accidents on the way to school. The fear in their eyes was palpable even now. He spoke to Pastor Franklin Cross, 71 years old, white-haired, and dignified despite the tremor in his hands. The pastor explained how Kane had tried to buy the land under First Baptist Church, offering a quarter of its value. When Pastor Cross refused, someone had spray-painted obscenities on the church doors and slashed the tires on the church van. He spoke to Caleb Stone, a 58-year-old veteran who'd served in Desert Storm, whose cabin had been broken into and ransacked while he was at a VA appointment. Caleb's Purple Heart medal stolen. His grandfather's watch gone. Things that had no monetary value, but meant everything. Every conversation added another piece to the puzzle. Every victim had the same story: refused, Kane faced consequences. And every one of them had been too afraid or too worn down to fight back. Until now, Garrett compiled everything into a digital folder. Photos, documents, timelines, witness statements recorded on his phone with permission. He sent it to Clayton with a simple message. "This enough to start?" Her response came 10 minutes later. "It's a start, but we need Kane directly connected. Keep digging." On the 3rd day after Atlas's attack, Garrett sat in his truck across the street from a bar called the Timber Lodge. It was 4 in the afternoon, the parking lot half full with work trucks and a black SUV, He recognized from the day Kane had visited his cabin. He'd been watching for 2 hours when three men emerged. He recognized them from Ruth's description: Marcus Wolfe with his graying beard, Lyle Croft with the scar through his eyebrow, and young Ethan Hale with his arm in a sling. Atlas had gotten a piece of him after all. Garrett recorded video on his phone as they climbed into a truck registered to Pinecrest Hauling LLC, one of Kane's shell companies. He followed them at a distance as they drove to a construction site on the north edge of town. He parked where he could see without being seen, watching them unload equipment, noting the company logos, the license plates, the times, and locations. Building a pattern, his phone buzzed. A text from Nora: Atlas is improving, eating on his own, wants to see you. Garrett allowed himself a small smile and drove back to the clinic. Atlas was sitting up when Garrett entered, his tail wagging properly for the first time in days. The bandages had been changed, revealing healing cuts and fading bruises. His swollen eye had opened partially, and both eyes tracked Garrett's movement with sharp intelligence. "There's my boy," Garrett said, kneeling down. Atlas leaned forward and licked his face thoroughly, tail going harder. Nora watched from the doorway. "He's healing faster than I expected. Tough old dog. Can I take him home tomorrow?" "Yes, but you'll need to keep him quiet for at least 2 weeks. No running, limited movement medication 3 times a day." She handed him a paper bag full of pill bottles. "And Garrett, be careful. Someone who will do this to a dog won't hesitate to do worse to a person." That night, Garrett sat alone in the cabin, reviewing everything he'd gathered. The evidence was substantial but circumstantial. Kane's name appeared nowhere directly. Everything traced back to his companies, his employees, but never to him personally. They needed something more, something that would tie Kane directly to the violence. His phone rang at 9 p.m. Clayton, her voice tight. "We have a problem. Just got a call from County Dispatch. Someone tried to run Ruth Aldridge off the road an hour ago. Dark truck, no plates visible. She's shaken but unhurt." Garrett's hand tightened on the phone. "Kane's escalating. Because you're asking questions, because people are starting to talk." Clayton exhaled slowly. "He knows we're building a case. He's trying to scare everyone back into silence. It won't work." "Maybe not. But Garrett, I can't protect all of them. I have 2 deputies for the entire county. If Kane decides to really apply pressure, then we need to move faster. Or you need to back off before someone gets killed." Garrett looked at the photos on his phone. Atlas hanging from the tree. Ruth's terrified face. The burned remains of Warren's house. "I'm not backing off," he said quietly. "But I have an idea. Something that might force Kane's hand." "I'm listening." "He thinks I'm afraid. Thinks that what happened to Atlas will make me fold. What if I let him believe that, then make him an offer he can't refuse? You want to bait him. I want to get him on record admitting what he did. Confession threat, something that ties him directly to Atlas and everything else." Clayton was quiet for a long moment. "That's dangerous. If he suspects a trap, he won't, because I'll make it real. I'll tell him I'm ready to sell, that I can't afford Atlas's medical bills, that I'm desperate. Men like Kane, they can't resist kicking someone when they're down. And you'll be wearing a wire. If you can provide one." Another pause. Then Clayton said, "Meet me tomorrow, early. We'll set this up right." They met at dawn in an empty parking lot on the edge of town. The air was cold enough to see breath, the sky still dark purple in the west. Clayton handed him a small recording device no bigger than a button and showed him how to activate it. "Keep the conversation on property and Atlas," she said. "Get him to reference what happened. And if he admits knowledge, makes threats, anything that shows intent, that's what we need. And if he doesn't bite, then we keep building the case the slow way." She looked at him seriously. "Garrett, if this goes wrong, if he suspects anything, you could end up like a Daniel." "Understood. Understood." "Good, because I'm not losing anyone else to Victor Kane." Garrett drove to Portland that morning, the recording device hidden under his shirt, practicing his lines in his head. He had to sell this, had to make Kane believe he'd broken. Kane's office occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming glass building in the Pearl District, the kind of place designed to intimidate, to remind visitors how small they were. The receptionist tried to turn him away, but Garrett simply said, "Tell Mr. Kane that Garrett Sullivan is here to discuss selling his property. He'll want to see me." 10 minutes later, he was being shown into an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victor Kane sat behind a massive desk of dark wood, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit probably worth more than Garrett's truck. He smiled as Garrett entered, the same practiced smile from their first meeting. "Mr. Sullivan, this is unexpected." Kane gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Garrett sat making sure the recording device was positioned correctly. I want to sell. Kane's smile widened. I'm glad you've reconsidered, though I'm sorry it took such unfortunate circumstances to change your mind. My dog's medical bills are $8,000. I can't afford that and the property taxes and everything else. So yeah, I'm selling. Of course, these things happen. Kane pulled out a folder already prepared. My original offer was 200,000. Given the complications, shall we say 150. That's half what the land's worth. Perhaps, but it's substantially more than you'll get from anyone else, and it's cash. Immediate relief from your financial difficulties. Kane leaned back in his chair. Unless you'd prefer to wait for another unfortunate accident. There it was, not quite an admission, but close. What happened to Atlas wasn't an accident, Garrett said carefully. Kane's expression didn't change. I wouldn't know anything about that, though I did hear he encountered some local troublemakers. Such a shame when animals get caught in the crossfire of human disputes. Is that what this is, a dispute? Mr. Sullivan, let me be frank. Kane opened a drawer and pulled out another folder, sliding it across the polished desk. Actually, before we discuss new terms, there's something you should see. Garrett opened the folder. Inside was a document he recognized, the land survey form Kane had presented during their first meeting. Except it wasn't just a survey anymore. Attached to it was a purchase agreement, his signature clearly visible at the bottom. I never signed this, Garrett said, keeping his voice level even as his pulse quickened. Oh, but you did, right here. Kane tapped the signature line with one manicured finger. That survey form you initialed, read the fine print, page 3, paragraph 7. Preliminary agreement to sell upon completion of environmental assessment, which was completed 2 weeks ago. Garrett's blood went cold. He'd signed that paper without reading it, trusting that it was what Kane claimed. A mistake, a rookie mistake that Kane had counted on. This won't hold up in court, Garrett said. Probably not, but it will tie you up in litigation for 2, maybe 3 years. Legal fees you can't afford, court costs, expert witnesses. By the time a judge finally rules in your favor, if they rule in your favor, you'll be bankrupt. Atlas's medical bills alone will force you into foreclosure. Kane leaned back, smiling with the confidence of a man who'd played this game 100 times. Or you could sign a legitimate contract today. 150,000. Walk away clean. Start fresh somewhere else. Take that dog and find some quiet place where no one bothers you. It was a trap with no good exit. Classic Kane, using the legal system itself as a weapon, drowning victims in procedures they couldn't afford to fight. But Garrett had one advantage Kane didn't know about: the recording device hidden under his shirt was capturing every word. Pine Ridge is changing whether the locals like it or not, Kane continued. I represent progress. People who resist progress tend to suffer unfortunate setbacks. Your dog, Warren Briggs' house, Daniel Reeves's tragic accident. He paused deliberately. These things don't have to continue. All you need to do is sign a piece of paper. Garrett felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. You're saying if I don't sell, something else will happen. I'm saying that accidents tend to follow people who make poor decisions. Your dog survived this time. Next time, Kane shrugged. Well, German Shepherds are old at 9. Their hearts give out sometimes, especially after trauma. The threat was clear, recorded, admitted. Garrett stood slowly. I'll think about it. Kane's smile faltered slightly. I'd recommend not thinking too long. My patience has limits, Mr. Sullivan, and I have people who are very good at helping indecisive individuals reach clarity. Like Marcus Wolf, Ethan Hale, Lyle Croft. Kane's eyes went flat and cold. I don't know those names. Sure you don't. Garrett turned toward the door, then paused. One more thing. You had someone plant a camera at my property to watch, to record what you did. I have no idea what you're talking about. Right, just like you had no idea about the fire at Warren's house, or the threats to the Henderson family, or running Ruth Aldridge off the road last night. Garrett met Kane's eyes. You know what your problem is? You think money makes you invisible, but everyone leaves traces, and I'm very good at finding them. Kane stood, his composure cracking for the first time. Get out of my office. I'm going. But we'll see each other again. In court. Garrett walked out, forcing himself to maintain a steady pace until he reached the elevator. His hands were shaking. The recording device felt like it was burning against his chest. He made it to his truck, drove 3 blocks, pulled over, and called Clayton. I got it, he said. All of it. He referenced Atlas Briggs, your son Ruth. Made direct threats, admitted to the fake contract. Everything. You're sure it's clear on the recording? Garrett played it back, listening to Kane's voice, admitting knowledge of everything threatening further violence, revealing the depth of his cruelty. That's clear enough, Clayton said, and he could hear the grim satisfaction in her voice. Get that recording to me. Now. Garrett drove straight to Pine Ridge, delivered the device to Clayton at her office. Watched as she listened to the recording twice, making notes, her expression hardening with each of Kane's words. When it finished, she looked up at Garrett. This is good, really good. But I need to verify chain of custody, get the county DA involved, maybe bring in state police or FBI. She hesitated. It could still take time, and Kane might run if he suspects we're coming. How long? Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. And Clayton stood and walked to the window, looking out at Main Street. I'm going to make some calls. Pull in every favor I have. The DA owes me. State police, too. We'll move as fast as we can. What do I do? Go get your dog. Take him home. Let him heal. And Garrett, she turned to face him. Stay away from Kane. Don't go back to Portland. Don't do anything that could compromise this case. We're so close. Don't give him an excuse to claim harassment or intimidation. Garrett nodded. I can do that. Good, I'll call you when we're ready to move. He drove to Nora's clinic and found Atlas waiting by the door, tail wagging, ready to go home. The dog's recovery was remarkable, already walking with more confidence, eating well, the light returning to his eyes. He's been like this all morning, Nora said, smiling. Knew you were coming somehow. Garrett helped Atlas into the truck, moving slowly to avoid jarring the healing ribs. The dog settled onto the bench seat, leaning against Garrett's side as they drove. Back at the cabin, Garrett carried Atlas inside, despite the dog's protest that he could walk. He set him on a thick blanket near the wood stove. Atlas circled once, then lay down with a contented sigh. For the first time in days, the cabin felt right again. Garrett sat beside him, hand resting on Atlas's head, and waited. Waited for Clayton to make her move. Waited for justice to finally arrive in Pine Ridge. Outside, evenings settled over the mountains. Somewhere in Portland, Victor Kane sat in his office making phone calls, trying to figure out if he'd just made a fatal mistake. He had. He just didn't know it yet. The call came at 4:30 in the morning, 5 days after Garrett had delivered the recording to Sheriff Clayton Reeves. He was already awake. Had been for an hour, sitting on the porch with Atlas at his feet, watching the sky lighten, from black to deep blue to the pale gray that came before dawn. Sleep had been difficult since bringing Atlas home. Not from nightmares this time, but from waiting. The evidence was strong, the recording was damning, but Garrett had learned in 18 years of service that the distance between evidence and justice could be measured in miles of red tape and mountains of bureaucratic procedure. Still, he waited, because this had to be done right. No shortcuts, no revenge fantasies, just the law applied with precision to a man who thought himself above it. When his phone vibrated, he answered before the second ring. It's happening, Clayton said without preamble. FBI is moving at 6 a.m. County D. A fast-track the warrants based on your recording, plus the evidence we compiled. State police are providing support. Garrett's hand tightened on the phone. Atlas lifted his head, ears forward, sensing the shift in his handler's energy. How many agencies? Enough that Kane won't slip through. They're hitting his office in Portland, his house in Lake Oswego, and 4 properties here in Pine Ridge simultaneously. Coordinated takedown. She paused. You should stay home. Let us handle this. I need to see it. Garrett, I won't interfere, but I need to see him answer for what he did. Wow, Clayton sighed, the sound carrying 3 years of grief and frustration, and finally the possibility of closure. Fine, but you stay in your vehicle, you stay out of the way, and if anyone asks, you're just a concerned citizen. Clear. Clear. Kane's house, 6:15, don't be late. She hung up. Garrett sat there for another minute, feeling something shift inside his chest. Not satisfaction yet. That would come later if it came at all. This was something else. The sense of a weight beginning to lift, of a promise about to be kept. He looked down at Atlas. The dog was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, head tilted slightly as if asking a question. We got him, boy, Garrett said quietly. They're moving this morning. Atlas's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Garrett went inside, made coffee he didn't drink, checked his watch every 2 minutes. At 5:45, he helped Atlas into the truck. The dog was moving much better now, still stiff but healing, with the resilience of a warrior who'd survived worse. They drove toward Lake Oswego through the pre-dawn darkness. Kane's house sat on 2 acres of manicured lawn overlooking the lake, a modern architectural statement of glass and steel worth at least $4 million. The kind of place designed to announce success, to separate its owner from ordinary people struggling with ordinary problems. The gate at the end of the long driveway was closed, but Garrett could see movement beyond it. Vehicles gathering in the darkness. Shadows moving with purpose. He parked on the street 100 yards away, engine off, and waited. Atlas sat up in the passenger seat, alert but calm, watching the same gate with the same patience he'd shown on countless missions. Waiting for the moment, trusting his partner to know when it came. At precisely 6 a.m., the gate swung open. 4 black SUVs rolled through like a mechanized fist, followed by 2 marked county sheriff's vehicles and a state police cruiser. They moved fast, doors opening before the vehicles had fully stopped, officers in tactical gear spreading out with practiced efficiency. Garrett watched through his truck's windshield as they approached the house. Saw lights flick on inside bright rectangles against the dimming darkness. Heard the faint sound of shouting, though he couldn't make out words from this distance. 3 minutes later, the front door opened and Victor Kane emerged in handcuffs. Even from a distance, Garrett could see the rage on his face. Kane was saying something, his mouth moving rapidly, probably demanding lawyers and making threats and invoking connections that no longer mattered. But the FBI agents flanking him weren't listening. They guided him toward one of the SUVs with the impersonal firmness of people who'd done this 1,000 times, who understood that money and influence ended the moment the cuffs went on. Kane saw Garrett's truck as they walked him past. Their eyes met across 100 yards of expensive landscaping. Garrett didn't smile, didn't wave, just sat there with his dog beside him, a man who'd promised to protect what mattered and had kept that promise despite everything Kane had thrown at him. Kane's face contorted with fury and he lunged forward, shouting something that got lost in the distance. The agents caught him, easily pushed him into the SUV, closed the door on whatever threats he was making. Clayton appeared from one of the sheriff's vehicles. She spoke briefly with an agent, then walked to the edge of the property and made a phone call. Garrett's phone buzzed 30 seconds later. "He's in custody," Clayton said. "Marcus Wolf, Lyle Croft, and Ethan Hale are being picked up as we speak. It's over." Garrett closed his eyes, let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for days. "Thank you," he said. "Thank yourself. Without that recording, we wouldn't have enough." Clayton's voice softened slightly. "How's Atlas getting stronger every day?" "Good. Come by the office this afternoon. There'll be paperwork, and the DA will want to meet you. Special Agent Morrison from the FBI will probably want to talk too." "I'll be there." Garrett sat in the truck for another 10 minutes watching as investigators went in and out of Kane's house, carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment. Then he started the engine and drove back to Pine Ridge. Atlas pressed against his side, warm and solid and alive. "Justice boy," Garrett murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Finally." News spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire carried on wind. By noon, Garrett's phone had buzzed with a dozen messages from people he barely knew. Ruth Aldridge called to cry with relief, her voice breaking as she thanked him over and over. Warren Briggs stopped by the cabin with a bottle of whiskey and a handshake that lasted a full minute, his calloused carpenter's hands trembling slightly. Pastor Franklin Cross invited him to Sunday service, said the whole congregation wanted to offer prayers of thanksgiving. Garrett declined politely. He wasn't ready for crowds or gratitude or being treated like some kind of hero. He'd just been a man protecting his dog. Anyone would have done the same, except they wouldn't have. That was the point. That was why Kane had operated for 3 years with impunity. What he needed was quiet. Time for Atlas to heal completely. Time to process what had happened and what came next. But the world had other plans. That afternoon, when Garrett arrived at the sheriff's office, he found Clayton behind her desk with 2 people he didn't recognize. One was a woman in her late 40s, dark-haired with gray at the temples, wearing a suit that said federal agent before she even showed her credentials. The other was a man in his early 50s, balding, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, and carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive. "Mr. Sullivan," the woman said, standing to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, professional. "Special Agent Diane Morrison, FBI. I wanted to thank you personally. Your recording was instrumental in building our case against Victor Kane." She gestured to the man beside her. "This is Assistant District Attorney Richard Holland. He'll be prosecuting." Holland shook Garrett's hand as well, his grip softer but no less earnest. "The recording you obtained is remarkable, Mr. Sullivan. Clear, unambiguous admissions of criminal conspiracy, extortion, and terroristic threatening. Combined with the physical evidence Sheriff Reeves compiled, we have an extraordinarily strong case." Garrett nodded, feeling oddly detached from the conversation. These people were talking about legal strategy and prosecution timelines, but all he could think about was Atlas hanging from that tree, blood dripping onto frozen ground. How long until trial, he asked. That depends on whether Kane takes a plea deal, Holland said. Given the strength of our evidence, I expect his attorneys will advise him to negotiate. But if he insists on going to trial, he shrugged. 4 to 6 months, probably. And the others, Wolfcroft Hale. Already talking, Morrison said with grim satisfaction. Ethan Hale broke within 2 hours of being arrested, gave us details on 12 other incidents we didn't even know about. Marcus Wolf is holding out, but Lyle Croft just took a plea deal this morning. 15 years in exchange for testimony against Kane. Clayton spoke up from behind her desk. What Morrison's too polite to say is that your case connected to something much bigger. The FBI's been tracking Kane for 11 months. Money laundering, wire fraud, racketeering across 4 states. They had the financial crimes mapped out, but couldn't get anyone to testify about the violence. Everyone was too scared. And now, Garrett asked? Now they're lining up, Morrison said. Funny how courage becomes contagious once the monster's in a cage. They talked for another hour about timelines and testimony and what Garrett should expect from the legal process. Holland assured him the preliminary hearing would be straightforward, just describe what happened to Atlas, authenticate the recording, and answer basic questions. Kane's lawyers will try to make you look like you entrapped him, Holland warned. They'll claim you manipulated the conversation, that you were acting as an agent of law enforcement without proper authorization. Will that work? Not a chance. You were a private citizen gathering evidence of crimes committed against you. The recording is admissible. And frankly, Mr. Sullivan, juries love stories about dogs, especially military dogs, especially when the defendant tortured one to send a message. Garrett left the sheriff's office as evening approached, his head spinning with legal terminology and procedures. But beneath the complexity, the reality was simple. Kane was in custody. His organization was collapsing. Justice was finally grinding forward. He drove back to the cabin and found Atlas waiting on the porch, tail wagging. The dog had started doing short patrols again, limping along the fence line, reclaiming the territory that had been violated. Garrett sat beside him on the porch steps, watching the sunset over the mountains. It's really over, boy, he said quietly. They got all of them. Atlas leaned against him, solid and warm, and they sat together as darkness fell. The weeks that followed passed in a strange rhythm of legal proceedings and slow healing. Atlas grew stronger day by day, the limp in his gait lessening, his energy returning. He still couldn't run the way he used to, probably never would, but he could patrol the perimeter of the cabin, and that seemed to satisfy him. Garrett testified at the preliminary hearing in early December. He sat in a witness box in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and described finding Atlas hanging from the tree. Described the medical bills, the camera, the conversation with Kane. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chen, 46 years old with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing, played the recording for a courtroom full of people who listened in absolute silence. Chen had spent 15 years with the Oregon Department of Justice prosecuting white-collar crime and had a reputation for dismantling cases that looked unwinnable. Her opening statement lasted 12 minutes and laid out Kane's empire of cruelty with surgical precision. Kane sat at the defense table, flanked by 3 expensive lawyers in suits that probably cost more than Garrett's truck. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but when the recording reached the part where he'd threatened Atlas's life, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition that he'd made a fatal mistake. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Chambers with gray hair and a reputation for fairness, bound Kane over for trial without hesitation. The evidence presented today suggests a pattern of criminal behavior extending over several years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. Mr. Kane, you will remain in custody without bail pending trial. This court finds substantial risk of flight and witness intimidation. Kane's lead attorney objected strenuously, argued about his client's ties to the community and lack of prior criminal record. Judge Chambers was unmoved. Your client allegedly orchestrated the torture of a military service dog and threatened numerous witnesses. He has significant financial resources and documented connections in multiple states. Bail is denied. Marcus Wolf, Lyle Croft, and Ethan Hale took plea deals. Wolf got 15 years, Croft got 12. Hale, who'd cooperated extensively, got 10. They'd be old men when they got out, their lives reduced to the same smallness they'd tried to inflict on others. Kane refused to plea, insisted on his innocence despite the mountain of evidence. His lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to suppress the recording, trying to argue entrapment, trying to delay the inevitable. It didn't work. The trial began in late January, 18 degrees outside, snow on the mountains, the courtroom heated to uncomfortable warmth. Garrett attended every day, sitting in the back row with Atlas at his feet. The judge had allowed it after prosecutors argued that the dog was central to the case. Atlas sat perfectly still as he'd been trained to do, a living reminder of what this was really about. Sarah Chen built her case methodically, like an architect constructing a building, one carefully placed brick at a time. She called Warren Briggs, who testified about his burned house producing the electrical inspection that proved the fire was no accident. Kane's lawyers tried to shake him on cross-examination, but Warren was unflappable, his carpenter's hands steady on the witness stand railing. She called the Hendersons, who described the threats against their daughter. The mother broke down crying when she described finding the broken bike on their porch, the father's jaw tight with barely controlled rage. She called Ruth Aldridge, who told the jury about finding Atlas hanging from a tree, her voice breaking as she described cutting him down. "I've seen a lot in 68 years, Ruth said quietly, but I've never seen cruelty like that. Never seen someone hurt an animal just to hurt the person who loved it." She called Pastor Franklin Cross, who provided documentation of the vandalism at his church and testimony about Kane's attempt to buy the land for a fraction of its value. She called Dr. Nora Whitmore, who provided medical testimony about Atlas's injuries, photographs that made several jurors look away. Nora walked them through each broken rib, each laceration, each calculated blow designed to cause maximum pain without killing. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," Nora testified. "This wasn't random violence. This was torture performed by people who understood canine anatomy well enough to hurt without killing." She called FBI agents who traced Kane's money, connecting him to shell companies and payoffs, and a web of corruption that stretched across 4 states. They presented financial records showing payments to Pinecrest Hauling LLC the day before Atlas was attacked, payments to Marcus Wolf's personal account, a paper trail that led directly back to Victor Kane. And she called Garrett. He walked to the witness stand with Atlas at his side. The courtroom went silent as they approached, every eye on the German Shepherd limping beside his handler. Judge Chambers had allowed it over defense objections, ruling that Atlas's presence was relevant and that his visible injuries were probative evidence. Garrett was sworn in. Atlas sat perfectly still beside the witness box, exactly as he'd been trained to do in his military service days. Sarah Chen approached, her manner professional but warm. "Mr. Sullivan, can you describe your relationship with Atlas?" "He was my partner. We served together for 6 years in Afghanistan. He saved my life more than once. Saved other lives too. 14 men pulled from a collapsed building in Kabul, 23 IEDs detected before they could kill. When I retired, I adopted him through the K-9 Veterans Program. And when you left him alone at your cabin last November, what did you expect would happen?" "I expected him to guard the property like he'd been trained to do. I expected him to be safe." Garrett's voice remained level, but his hands gripped the railing. "I trusted that people would leave him alone, that even if someone wanted to hurt me, they wouldn't hurt an animal." "Did you have any reason to believe someone might harm Atlas?" Garrett described Kane's visit to the cabin, the escalating threats, the veiled references to Atlas's age and health. He described the vandalism, the slashed tires, the shotgun shell left on his porch. "Did you report these incidents to law enforcement?" "I filed a report about my truck. The deputy said there wasn't much they could do without evidence." "What happened when you returned from your job in Idaho?" Garrett described finding Atlas. His voice remained steady, controlled, but his eyes went distant as he spoke. The courtroom was utterly silent. 2 jurors were crying. "Ruth Aldridge had cut him down by the time I arrived, but I saw the rope, the blood, the carving on the tree." He paused. "And I found the camera." Chen introduced the crushed camera into evidence, explaining how it had been found at the scene. "What did this discovery tell you, Mr. Sullivan?" "That whoever did this wanted to watch, wanted to record my reaction. That it wasn't just about hurting Atlas, it was about hurting me through him." Then Chen played the recording. The courtroom filled with Kane's voice, smooth and confident, admitting knowledge of Atlas's attack, threatening future harm, connecting himself to every crime the prosecution had outlined. "Your dog survived this time. Next time, well, German Shepherds are old at 9. Their hearts give out sometimes." When it finished, you could have heard a pin drop. Chen asked, "Mr. Sullivan, what did you understand Mr. Kane to be saying?" "That he'd ordered the attack on Atlas, and that if I didn't comply with his demands, he'd do it again. He'd make sure Atlas didn't survive next time." Kane's lead attorney, a man named Douglas Brennan, who'd flown in from Seattle, expensive suit and expensive haircut, and 30 years of defending wealthy criminals, cross-examined aggressively. He tried to paint Garrett as a vigilante seeking revenge, tried to suggest the recording was manipulated or taken out of context, tried to make Garrett seem like an unstable veteran with PTSD who couldn't be trusted. Garrett had been interrogated by better than a Portland defense lawyer. He answered every question calmly, never raising his voice, never losing his composure. Isn't it true, Mr. Sullivan, that you went to Mr. Kane's office with the specific intent to entrap him? I went to gather evidence of crimes committed against me. But you were working with Sheriff Reeves, weren't you? Acting as an agent of law enforcement? I was a private citizen documenting threats made against me and my property. Your property being a dog. Atlas isn't property. He's my partner. And yes, I was documenting threats against him. Brennan tried several more angles, but none of them landed. By the time Garrett stepped down, even the defense attorney looked deflated. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Garrett was at the cabin when Clayton called with the news. He'd been splitting wood, trying to keep his hands busy, trying not to think about 12 strangers in a room deciding whether justice meant anything. Guilty, Clayton said, and he could hear her voice breaking. All 47 counts, every single one. Garrett sat down heavily on the porch steps. Atlas pressed against his leg, sensing the emotion his handler was barely containing. When's sentencing? 2 weeks. Judge Chambers doesn't waste time. Good. They sat in silence for a moment, connected by phone across 10 miles and 3 years of fighting for this moment. Daniel would be proud, Clayton finally said. You finished what he started. We finished it, Garrett corrected. All of us. Sentencing came on a cold February morning. Garrett attended along with Ruth and Warren and Pastor Cross and a dozen other victims who'd found the courage to speak. The courtroom was packed. Judge Chambers entered and everyone stood. She didn't waste time with preliminaries. Mr. Kane, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 47 counts, including extortion, conspiracy, animal cruelty, terroristic threatening wire fraud, and racketeering. Do you have anything to say before I impose sentence? Kane stood, his expensive suit rumpled from weeks in county jail, his silver hair less perfectly styled. I maintain my innocence, he said stiffly. I will appeal this miscarriage of justice. Judge Chambers looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd heard this speech 1,000 times and was no more impressed now than she'd been the first time. Mr. Kane, she said, you systematically terrorized an entire community for personal profit. You hurt animals, destroyed property, and quite possibly caused the death of at least one person. You showed no mercy to your victims. This court will show none to you. She paused, letting that sink in. On the counts of racketeering and wire fraud, this court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison. On the counts of extortion and conspiracy, an additional 12 years. On the count of aggravated animal cruelty, 5 years. She looked at him directly. These sentences will run consecutively, not concurrently. That's a total of 32 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Kane's face went white. His lawyers immediately began talking about appeals, but everyone in the courtroom knew the truth. Victor Kane was 62 years old. He'd die in prison. Judge Chambers wasn't finished. Furthermore, all properties and assets obtained through your criminal enterprise are hereby forfeited. The funds will be distributed to your victims as restitution for damages incurred. She brought her gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the victims. Garrett avoided them, walking to his truck with Atlas limping beside him. But Clayton caught up before he could leave. There's one more thing, she said, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the parking lot. The restitution funds, based on your medical bills and the trauma to Atlas, you're entitled to compensation. Substantial compensation. I don't want Kane's money. It's not about what you want. It's about making you whole. Clayton handed him an envelope. The victim services coordinator will be in touch. But Garrett, use it. Get Atlas the best care available. Fix your truck. Pay off your debts. You earned this. He took the envelope without opening it. What about the others? Everyone's getting something. Warren's rebuilding his house. The Hendersons are putting their kids through college. Ruth's starting a fund for other victims of property crimes. Clayton smiled slightly. Good things because of what you started. What you started? Garrett corrected. I just recorded a conversation. You did a lot more than that. You gave people hope, showed them that standing up matters. She paused and her voice softened. Daniel would have done the same thing. I think that's why I helped you. Felt like finishing what he started. They stood in the parking lot, two veterans who'd lost too much but refused to lose everything. Thank you, Garrett said finally. Thank you. He drove back to Pine Ridge as evening settled over the mountains, Atlas asleep on the seat beside him, the envelope still unopened on the dashboard. 3 days after the sentencing, Garrett drove to Pinewood Cemetery on the eastern edge of Pine Ridge. He'd asked Clayton for the location, and she'd texted back a simple pin drop without questions. Daniel Christopher Reeves, 1996 to 2022. Beloved son, faithful friend. The headstone was granite simple and dignified. Someone Clayton probably kept fresh flowers there. This week it was white roses, their petals edged with frost. Garrett knelt in the grass feeling awkward but compelled. Your mother got him, he said quietly as if the young man 6 feet below could hear. Kane's going to die in prison. 32 years, no parole. He's done. The wind moved through the cemetery pines carrying the scent of snow and distant wood smoke. She's strong, your mom, stronger than she probably lets on. Helped me when she had every reason not to, when she could have walked away and protected herself. Garrett paused, searching for words. I'm using the restitution money to build something. A sanctuary for military dogs. Figured maybe that's something you'd have supported. Way to make meaning out of all this. He stood feeling the ache in his knees, the weight of 40 years lived hard. Rest easy. He can't hurt anyone else now. When Garrett turned to leave, Clayton was standing by the cemetery gate beside her patrol car. She'd changed out of uniform jeans, a simple gray jacket, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger somehow. Or maybe just less burdened. She walked over, moving slowly, and stood beside him, looking at her son's grave. I come here every Sunday, she said. Tell him about my week, about the cases I'm working. Probably sounds crazy. No, Garrett said. It sounds right. They stood in silence for a moment, two people who'd lost too much but refused to lose everything. Thank you, Clayton finally said, for giving me the chance to finish what Daniel started. For being brave enough to stand when standing was dangerous. Thank you for believing me, for fighting alongside me. Clayton turned to face him fully. The sanctuary. You'll need help getting it off the ground. Permits, inspections, all the bureaucratic nonsense. I know people. County supervisor owes me a favor. I'd appreciate that. And Garrett, she offered a small, genuine smile. Daniel would have liked you, would have been proud to call you friend. The words hit harder than Garrett expected. He nodded, not trusting his voice. They walked back to their vehicles together, and when Clayton drove away, Garrett felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sense that he wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. That community, real community, was something worth building, worth protecting, worth fighting for. Spring came slowly to Pine Ridge, arriving in increments of melting snow and greening trees and warmer mornings that didn't hurt to breathe. Garrett used the restitution money carefully, paid off his debts first, all $47,000, plus the medical bills from Atlas's treatment. What remained was substantial, more than he'd ever had at once. The property adjacent to his cabin had belonged to one of Kane's shell companies. It went up for auction as part of the asset forfeiture. 40 acres of pine forest and meadow, a small barn that needed work, a well that still pumped clean water. Garrett bought it for a fraction of its value. No other bidder showed up. People in Pine Ridge understood what he was building and wanted to help, not hinder. He spent March and April rebuilding using skills he'd learned in the Navy and skills he taught himself from videos and books. Fences strong enough to contain energetic dogs but open enough to let them see the forest. Kennels with heated floors for cold nights. A small office in the renovated barn with space for medical records and adoption files. Signs that read, Atlas Legacy Sanctuary, K9 Veterans Welcome. Nora helped him navigate the nonprofit paperwork, her veterinary expertise invaluable in designing spaces that would keep the dogs healthy and comfortable. Clayton spread the word through law enforcement networks, sending emails to K9 units across the Pacific Northwest. Warren and Ruth and half a dozen other victims volunteered their time, showing up on weekends with tools and enthusiasm, and a desire to turn something terrible into something good. By May, they had their first resident. A 10-year-old Belgian Malinois named Sargent retired from the Portland Police Department after his handler died of cancer. The dog had been scheduled for euthanasia, too old to rehome, too aggressive for a civilian family, medical issues that would cost thousands to treat. Garrett drove to Portland and picked him up from the shelter. Sargent growled the whole way back, suspicious and grieving, and not sure whether to trust this stranger. At the sanctuary, Garrett let him off the leash in the main enclosure. Atlas limped over and the two dogs touched noses, some wordless communication passing between them. Understanding, recognition, the knowledge that they were both warriors who'd served and suffered and survived. Sargent stayed. Then came a German shepherd from Eugene, an 11-year-old female named Dakota, who'd served with the army in Iraq and come home with vision problems and arthritis. A Labrador from Seattle who'd lost his handler to suicide and refused to eat for anyone else. A mixed breed from Spokane with 3 legs and PTSD that made him afraid of loud noises. Each dog carried wounds visible and invisible. Each had given years of service and received abandonment in return. At Atlas Legacy Sanctuary, they found peace. Word spread through the tight-knit community of military dog handlers and law enforcement canine units. Donations arrived, bags of premium dog food, medical supplies, monetary contributions from people who understood what these animals had sacrificed. A veterinary clinic in Portland offered free care for any dog the sanctuary took in. A local feed store provided supplies at cost. The county waived permit fees. By June, they had 11 dogs. Garrett spent his days maintaining the property, working with the mice, coordinating with volunteers. He slept better than he had in years. The nightmares came less frequently. When they did, he'd wake to find Atlas pressed against him in the darkness, a solid reminder that he wasn't alone, that they'd both survived, that survival meant something. One morning in early July, Clayton stopped by with coffee and a box of Ruth's homemade cookies. "Brought you something," she said, handing him a folder. Inside was a photo, Kane in orange prison scrubs, hands cuffed, being led into F's with Sheridan. He looked older, diminished, nothing like the confident man who'd threatened Garrett's home and hurt his dog. "Thought you might want to see," Clayton said. He tried to appeal. Ninth Circuit denied it yesterday. He's done. Garrett studied the photo for a long moment, then handed it back. "I don't need to see him anymore." "Fair enough." Clayton tucked the folder under her arm and looked around the sanctuary. "How's everything going?" "Good, really good. We're at capacity now, but I'm thinking about expanding. Maybe add another barn, take on a few more dogs." "Need any help with that?" Garrett looked at her. "You offering to mine? I've got some vacation time saved up. Thought maybe I could volunteer. Get my hands dirty, work with the dogs." She paused. "Seems like good therapy." "Yeah," Garrett said quietly. "It is." They walked the property together, checking on the dogs, talking about expansion plans and fundraising, and the quiet satisfaction of building something good from the ashes of something terrible. Atlas followed, moving slower now, but content, his tail wagging as younger dogs played around him. He'd become the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, greeting new arrivals with patience and wisdom, showing them that this was a safe place. That evening, Garrett sat on the porch of his cabin with Atlas at his feet and watched the sun set over the mountains. The sky burned orange and red and purple colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal. He thought about the past months, about pain and justice and the long road from one to the other, about the people who'd stood with him when standing was dangerous, about the Buenos sleeping peacefully in the sanctuary barn, safe because someone had finally said enough. His phone buzzed. A text from Nora. "New intake tomorrow. 7-year-old GSD from Tacoma. Handler killed in line of duty. You have room." Garrett texted back, "Always." He set the phone down and rested his hand on Atlas's head. The dog leaned into him, warm and alive, and exactly where he was supposed to be. "We did it, boy," Garrett said quietly. "We actually did it." Atlas's tail thumped against the porch boards. People sometimes asked Garrett if he believed in miracles. He'd think about Atlas hanging from that tree, broken and bleeding, but refusing to quit. He'd think about a community of strangers becoming family. He'd think about justice arriving when it seemed impossible. And he'd say yes, but miracles don't fall from the sky. They're built by people who refuse to accept that evil should win. They're built by loyalty that won't break, by courage that won't bend, by ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone has to. God doesn't promise easy roads, Garrett had learned, but he walks beside us. And sometimes he sends a four-legged angel to remind us we're never truly alone. The Bible says in Proverbs 12, verse 10, "The righteous care for the needs of their animals." Garrett understood that now in a way he never had before. Caring for Atlas had saved them both. Building the sanctuary was saving others. Not just the dogs, but the veterans who volunteered there, who found purpose in service again. The community that had rallied around them, discovering their own strength. It was all connected, all part of something larger than any individual act of courage or kindness. As darkness settled over Pine Ridge, Garrett looked up at the emerging stars and thought about everyone who'd made this possible. About Daniel Reeves, who'd stood his ground and paid with his life, but whose sacrifice had planted seeds of resistance. About Clayton, who'd turned grief into determination. About Ruth and Warren and Pastor Cross and all the others who'd been brave enough to speak. And about Atlas, who'd endured unthinkable cruelty and come out the other side, still capable of love, still willing to trust. "Thank you," Garrett whispered to whatever power governed the universe. "For second chances. For justice. For him." Atlas stirred, lifting his head to look at Garrett with those dark, knowing eyes. Then he stood stretched carefully, and walked to the edge of the porch to watch the sanctuary barn where his new pack was settling in for the night. 11 dogs who'd served their country and been cast aside. 11 warriors finding peace in their final years. Tomorrow there would be 12. And Garrett would be there to welcome the new arrival, to show them that service wasn't forgotten, that sacrifice mattered, that they were home. He stood and joined Atlas at the porch railing, two old soldiers watching over their domain. The lights in the sanctuary barn glowed warm against the darkness. Somewhere inside, a dog barked once, then settled. All quiet, all safe, all well. In that moment, standing on a weathered porch in the Oregon wilderness with his best friend beside him and the sanctuary full of rescued souls sleeping peacefully, Garrett Sullivan finally understood what it meant to be home. Not a place. Not four walls and a roof, but the peace that comes from standing firm when tested, from protecting what matters, from building something good in a world that often feels overwhelmed by darkness. He was home. They both were. And tomorrow they'd save another one. The screen faded to text Atlas lived to age 11. He died peacefully in his sleep on August 14th, 2027, surrounded by the family he'd built at the sanctuary. He was buried with military honors under the big pine tree where he'd once hung, broken, the same tree that now stood as a symbol of survival and hope. Victor Kane is currently serving his sentence at FCNE Sheridan, Oregon. He will be eligible for release in 2057 at age 94. Atlas Legacy Sanctuary has rescued 47 military working dogs and helped 280 veterans reconnect with purpose through volunteer work. The sanctuary operates entirely on donations and volunteer support. If you know a veteran or military working dog in need, visit atlaslegacy.org. To every veteran watching, your service matters. Your sacrifices are seen. You are not forgotten. To every person fighting darkness in their own way, stand firm. The truth will prevail. May God bless you and keep you. May He give you the courage to protect what you love and the strength to stand when standing is hard. Subscribe for more stories of courage and faith. Comment below. What would you fight for? Where are you watching from? And remember, when good people stand together, even the powerful must answer for their crimes. God bless our veterans. God bless our K9 heroes. God bless America. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant bark of a dog greeting the morning.